meeting number 71 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans. This meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to House Order of June 23rd, 2022. Before we proceed, I would like to remind everyone to address all comments through the chair. In accordance with the committee's routine motion concerning connection tests for witnesses, I'm informing the committee that all witnesses have completed the required connection tests in advance of the meeting. Before we begin with testimony today, witness testimony, we have one quick committee business item to get out of the way, and I'd like to do it now versus later. 2 study budgets were distributed to members earlier today. Does the committee agree to adopt the proposed budget in the amount of $2,000 for the DFO briefing on Report 21 of the 42nd Parliament?
I move, Mr. Chair, we adopt it.
Okay, any opposed? Okay, not hearing none. Adopted. The next one is, does the committee agree to adopt the proposed budget in the amount of $26,000 for the study of the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission?
So moved, Mr. Chair.
Okay, so moved by Mr. Morrissey. Anyone in dissension or not in favor? Okay, we'll consider it all in favor, and we'll move on now to our witnesses. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted on January 20th, 2022, the committee is resuming the study of foreign ownership and corporate concentration of fishing licenses and quota. I would like to welcome our first panel of witnesses. Representing the British Columbia Crab Fishermen's Association, we have Duncan Cameron, Director. Representing the Competition Bureau, we have Brad Callaghan, Associate Deputy Commissioner, Policy Planning and Advocacy Directorate. We have Anthony DeRoche, Deputy Commissioner, Competition Promotion Branch. And we have Pierre-Yves Gay, Associate Deputy Minister, Cartels Directorate. And if I mispronounced anyone's name, I do apologize. So we will now go to our first witness to have 5 minutes or less. Mr. Cameron, please.
Good afternoon, honorable members of Parliament and Chairperson. My name is Duncan Cameron. I'm a 4th-generation fisherman, and I sit before you today as a representative of the BC Crab Fishermen's Association. Our board is made up of elected representatives from different management areas of our coast. Our areas are lettered similar to how lobster districts are numbered on the East Coast. However, every 3 years we can select different areas. All our directors are active crab harvesters. The Dungeness crab fishery is BC's most valuable fishery and has some of the most advanced monitoring tools in the world. The crab fishery was the first in North America to introduce video monitoring in conjunction with RFID scan traps, GPS speed algorithm, and robust conditions of license to meet conservation objectives. Unfortunately, we now find ourselves confronted with a pressing issue that threatens the very foundation of our industry. The ability of processors, foreign interests, and large corporations to acquire fishing licenses directly undermines the conservation of our species, reconciliation efforts, and landed value of our catch. Since 2018, we have been advocating for DFO to restrict license ownership solely to First Nations fishery initiatives and individual fishermen, but unfortunately our pleas have gone unanswered. Our request for this crucial policy change was and is driven by ongoing reconciliation processes and court directives aimed at granting First Nations access to the fishery. The Reconciliation Framework Agreement signed between Coastal First Nations and the Government of Canada, as well as the House case affirming rights to fish, have indicated the use of a willing buyer, willing seller mechanism. As the Howsett Nation realized their crab rights through their appeal decision, the Canadian government was ordered to buy back the equivalent access awarded to a Howsett from active harvesters. However, because processors were able to compete in buying licenses, only a few licenses were bought back, and instead many of the licenses were purchased by processors. The department did nothing to make licenses available and failed to take action, leaving us to bear the consequences. As a result of this inaction, we have witnessed adverse impacts on multiple fronts. Access has been reallocated without proper mitigation for existing harvesters, leading to tensions between Indigenous and non-Indigenous harvesters. Illegal sales fisheries have thrived, particularly during biologically sensitive crab seasons, and access to First Nations outside of a Howsett territory has been diluted as harvesters move to other areas upon 3-year reselection. It is crucial to recognize that processors can secure seafood through alternative means, such as developing new markets, offering competitive services or pricing, or partnering with First Nations for access. All of these avenues lead to positive outcomes for the fishery and coastal communities. The processing facilities required for crab are much simpler and lower cost compared to other fisheries that make up fin fish and other species. That is why we have so many more processing facilities for crab than other species. Similarly, investors can invest in the seafood industry by investing in infrastructure or other sectors of the marine industry in search of a return on investment from our ocean's economy. However, fishermen depend on fishing licenses to access and exercise their livelihoods. A fallacy that has been communicated from the Pacific region by DFO and others is that conservation objectives being different in BC have shaped licensing policy. This cannot be further from the truth. Ownership of fishing licenses in our fishery, as a majority of fisheries, has nothing to do with conservation, and it is not a tool to manage effort. We manage effort in conservation through spatial closures, haul restrictions, trap limits, trap size, bait restrictions, crab size, biological sampling, and many other tools. We do not use license ownership or transferability to achieve conservation objectives. Another common argument presented against this change is that access concerns such as marine protected areas are much more concerning to harvesters than license ownership. While MPAs may be a very serious concern and certainly one we share, two things can be true at once. We need to have access to fishing grounds and we need to see the benefits of the fishery. A more disingenuous part of this argument is ignoring the fact that license ownership directly links to access decisions. In the MPA example, we can see that where First Nations own access and surrounding communities benefit from the fishery, the proposed protected areas have significantly fewer areas proposed to be closed to our crab fishery. The simple logic is when a community member sees benefits from sustainable fisheries, they are not as likely to restrict us. In closing, we recommend the following. 1, immediately restrict the sale of licenses to fishermen and First Nations. 2, commit more capacity to the Pacific region to this issue and realize socioeconomic benefits of the fishery, specifically human capacity. And 3, increase regulatory oversight for commercial fishing boat and license brokerages, as outside of the commercial crab fishery, there is essentially only one brokerage. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for that, Mr. Cameron. A little under time, which is always good to see. We'll now go to Mr. Callaghan for an opening statement of 5 minutes or less.
Monsieur le Président, membres du...
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, hello. Thank you for the invitation to appear before you today. My name is Brad Callaghan, and I'm the Associate Deputy Commissioner of the Competition Bureau's Policy, Planning, and Advocacy Directorate. I am joined today by my colleagues, Pierre-Yves Gay, Associate Deputy Commissioner of the Cartels Directorate, as well as Anthony Durocher, Deputy Commissioner of the Competition Promotion Branch. The Bureau is an independent law enforcement agency that protects and promotes competition for the benefit of Canadian consumers and businesses. We administer and enforce Canada's Competition Act, a law of general application that applies to every sector of the economy. We investigate and address abuses of market power, anti-competitive mergers, price fixing, and deceptive marketing practices. The Bureau also advocates for pro-competitive government rules and regulations. Evidence-based enforcement is at the heart of what the Bureau does, and this requires that our actions be based on credible evidence that can withstand judicial scrutiny. It's important to recognize that we are enforcers and not adjudicators. The Competition Act requires us to meet several thresholds and standards, such as proving that there has been significant harm to competition. Regardless of if we want to bring a case forward, we are guided by the decisions of the Competition Tribunal and the courts.
Short comments in relation to the focus of the committee's study on foreign ownership and corporate concentration of fishing licenses and quota, just to help situate the Competition Bureau within it. First, on the foreign ownership aspect, it's important to understand that our analysis is focused on protecting and promoting the intensity of competition overall. The nationality of the companies bringing that competition is not part of our framework. Those considerations would typically fall under other mandates, including the consideration of ISED's Investment Review Division under the Investment Canada Act. With respect to corporate concentration, the Bureau does not regularly evaluate overall levels of concentration or the state of competition in particular markets. In our enforcement work, the Bureau looks at specific conduct or allegations on a case-by-case basis. For example, we would examine whether a specific merger between two companies would substantially lessen or prevent competition in a particular market. Before fielding your questions, I would just note that the law requires us to conduct the Bureau's investigations in private and keep the information that we have confidential, and that obligation may prevent us from discussing some of our past or current investigations. I would like to thank the committee for the opportunity to appear today, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you for that. Another person a little bit under the 5-minute mark, which we don't see very often. We'll now go to our first round of questioning with Mr. Arnold for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. I'll start out with Mr. Cameron quickly, if I can. You talked about conservation and sustainability. Will there come a point in time where you believe that license ownership will be more of an issue in managing for conservation and sustainability?
Not in our fishery. You have a crab license, and we use many other tools to realize conservation.
Okay, thank you. I want to turn my questioning now to the representatives from the Competition Bureau. On May 11th, a witness told the committee that the Competition Bureau uses a 4-firm concentration ratio. If the top 4 firms have less than 65% of the relative market, the Bureau is not generally concerned. Is that a correct statement?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. Yeah, we have 2 what we call safe harbor thresholds that basically give indications to stakeholders as to when a merger, for instance, can raise competition issues. So one is if a single firm would hold more than 35% in a given market, and the other being if the top 4 firms would hold 65%. I would just say that these are only safe harbor thresholds, and we look at every case on the basis of the evidence. So we can take cases where those thresholds are not exceeded or if they are exceeded.
Okay, thank you. In assessing corporate concentration, does the Competition Bureau consider how much the biggest firms purchase or only what they sell to their share of the relevant market?
Thank you. It would be both. So it depends on the circumstances, but if we look at a processor, for instance, we would look at both the purchase dimension and look at a potential lessening in competition for how much people are paying for their input and whether they can actually decrease the price paid for inputs. And conversely, on the supply side, the sales side, we would look at whether there's a lessening or prevention of competition in terms of how much is charged to people down the supply chain, be it distributors or retailers, and their ability to increase the price.
Okay, thank you. In assessing the concentration level of firms in a sector, does the Competition Bureau consider how much of a specific species of fish is bought by a firm or firms with relevant market, within a relevant market?
So every merger analysis would be different in terms of looking at the particular facts at play, but we would aim generally to define a market and look at the relevant metrics of concentration for a potential exercise of market power. So in a case of where we're looking at upstream issues and the potential for exercise over the purchase of an input, we would look at all relevant metrics to assess concentration and remaining competitors in that market for the purchase of an input.
Okay, in assessing those metrics in corporate concentration, does the Competition Bureau identify and include all subsidiaries of a corporation in those assessments?
Yes. So generally, as part of our analysis, when we identify merging parties, we would look at affiliates or also so affiliates is defined under the Competition Act as generally being a company in which you have over 50% interest or what we call control. But there can be instances where you're below that and you still have a minority interest in a company that affords you the ability to control the economic behavior of that company. So that those are things that we would take into account. So we look at, not just a de facto but de jure control of companies.
Okay, and how does the Competition Bureau determine that they're assessing all subsidies of a corporation and not just the corporation itself? All subsidiaries?
When a transaction exceeds certain financial thresholds, companies must notify the Competition Bureau before they can consummate their transaction.
What would that threshold be?
So there are two thresholds, and both must be exceeded. So the first one is that all parties to a merger must have more than $400 million in assets or revenues generated from those assets. And the second threshold, and again, both must be met, is that the assets being acquired must generate more than $93 million in sales, or the value of those assets themselves is $93 million. So when a merger exceeds those thresholds is notifiable, companies must provide us with prescribed information to enable us to do a review.
Okay, and how would you define the relevant market of Canadian fish and seafood?
Every case would be looked at on its own merits. So we would have to look at the specific set of facts for a given merger in the fishery space to determine what is the appropriate product dimension of the market, what is the appropriate geographic dimension of the market. And how we do our work is that answering these questions are largely informed by gathering facts from the marketplace. So we would typically interview suppliers, competitors, customers, industry association experts, and also review company documents to make sure that we're making an informed determination of what the relevant scope of the markets at play, but more importantly, what are the competitive dynamics at play.
Okay, thank you. I believe my time is up. Thank you.
Yes, just ran out, Mr. Reynolds. We'll now go to Mr. Hardy for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to everybody who's here today. Mr. Cameron, good to see you again. You've been kind of almost a frequent flyer at these hearings. You mentioned that there should be steps to restrict the sale of licenses and quota basically to Canadians. Is that correct?
More so to actual individual fishermen or to First Nations.
Okay. So if somebody was to sell a license or quota to another entity or individual who just simply leased them out, that should not be something that's allowed?
You would have to decide at that point because in different First Nations fishery initiatives, they want the ability to lease to different members. So I think it would be a little different in that scenario. But as an independent harvester, I would say no.
Now, you attended some sessions in Victoria earlier this year, and almost as a side comment, you mentioned the fact that you, in fact, had sold a license. Is that correct?
I've bought and sold licenses in my fishing career. Yeah.
Okay. And I guess, it's only human and only natural, and certainly the free market would suggest that you'll want to get the best price you can, especially when you're selling, and the lowest price you can when you're buying. Is that right?
At least the best price when you're selling, yeah.
Yeah. So how then, especially given our sense that so many licenses and so much quota is in the hands of people who, if we were to make a transition to an owner-operator fleet separation regime, how could we get through that process and not really unduly harm people who up to now have been playing by the rules, but who have a considerable amount of wealth at least tied up in the licenses and quota that they own but don't fish?
I would say the demand is so strong that you would almost have to not worry about it. This government has given hundreds of millions of dollars to CFN specifically. There's a lot of capital that would make that process fairly seamless. I imagine prices will drop a little bit potentially, but I don't think there's going to be this big cliff. I think Paul Correa put it pretty straightforward when he testified here. They've been given a lot of money to buy licenses, and if they don't have the ability and supply to buy those licenses, the access will be expropriated straight towards them. So that's a much bigger concern to license valuations than restricting who could purchase them.
the acquisition or provision of licenses and quota to First Nations communities, I've raised the issue that, if that happens and the community actually gets its hands on license or quota, that represents an opportunity for somebody in that community to actually be engaged in the fishing activities and, the usual flow of economic and other benefits back to the community. But we also know that some of the communities, and you mentioned this just now, would prefer to lease that out. And it wouldn't necessarily be to a band member. It could be to anybody. Do you think that something needs to change there?
To be honest, I just don't think it's our place to really speak as to how they exercise those rights. We certainly, feel for harvesters that want to be on the water, but we're not in a place to, at this time, determine self-determination for different nations. So we can speak more to independent harvesters than that.
All right, I appreciate that, Mr. Cameron. Mr. Callahan, vertical integration has become a reality and an economic necessity, I guess, in the industry out at the coast. You spend a lot of money on processing facility, and obviously you want the material that goes into it. But add to that many harvesters get access to quota or licenses through a processor, and they're then indentured to that processor to sell to them. The price is set before the season starts, and the fisher gets paid whatever the market or whatever the processor is willing to pay them after the fact. Does that scenario not concern the Competition Bureau?
My colleague, Mr. Drosha, may have something to add on this point, just from the perspective of potential merger review. But I would say vertical integration is not something that, in and of itself, would cause concern. There certainly are cases when vertical integration can bring efficiencies and can lead to pro-competitive outcomes. But that said, we would look at every case on its own merits, and it's maybe an opportunity to say that my colleague, Mr. Durocher, has mentioned notification thresholds where the Bureau would be made aware of transactions, mergers in the space. But I'll just mention that the Bureau can review transactions, mergers of any size. But in and of themselves, they wouldn't necessarily raise competition concerns, and we would evaluate each one on their own facts to see if there is an effect on competition.
In fact, has the Competition Bureau, has your agency ever been asked to look into a merger, such as, for instance, the acquisition of the Canada Fishing Company by Jim Pattison Industries? I'll use that as an example. You don't have to confirm whether or not that was one, but have you ever actually had to look into a transaction out of the West Coast?
Yes, we have. I would say we've looked at probably a half dozen mergers in this space, mostly on the processing side, over the last 4 years. None of which we've taken action, but all of which have undergone a thorough competition review.
Do you think you need more latitude?
Thank you, Mr. Hardy. Your time is up, right on the mark. We'll now go to Madam Debbie N for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you very much. Happy to see you here. We were looking forward to having you. So how does the Competition Bureau work when an outside company wants to purchase within Canada or Quebec? How does this work? What are the first steps? Thank you for the question. So firstly, we have to verify, or rather, the nationality of a company doesn't matter much to us. It's the competition. But when there is a proposed merger, the first question that we ask usually is if we have gone beyond the financial thresholds, like I said earlier. And if they have surpassed these thresholds, the company needs to give notice to the Bureau of Competition. And then we need to ensure that there are no competition issues, and we will do an assessment. And then we need to ensure that we have the time to look at the situation before the transaction is completed. Now, this being said, for transactions that don't surpass these thresholds, we can still assess them to ensure that there are no competition issues. And we have a team that looks for information in the market to make sure that we're aware of potentially problematic mergers. Oftentimes, we will receive third-party complaints, be it consumers or producers, to tell us that there is a problematic merger. And we will look at the facts and determine if we want to begin an assessment of the transaction. Once we've assessed the transaction, we've looked at documents, we've done interviews, sometimes we hire experts. The threshold that we need to meet to see if we need to act depends on whether or not there has been a significant reduction in competition. Yes, so really it's a legal threshold that we have established in our laws. And it's quite rare that it's the case, but if we do find this, it's very serious. It can have a serious impact on an industry. And so we can bring our case to the competition tribunal, and there are several options there. For example, we can seize their assets to deal with the competition issue, or we could begin negotiations with the company to come to a friendly agreement. And this is called a consent agreement. And this is an agreement that will be, again, friendly and will be done with the tribunal. And there may be corrective measures to ensure that we are rectifying any imbalances in competition. Now, in this context, we know that things are increasing in terms of thresholds. If a company does not have a certain amount of resources, they may multiply the number of small transactions instead of a transaction that surpasses your threshold. Have you taken that into account? Yes. Now, it's interesting because we've had recent amendments to the Competition Act that mean that it's actually now more difficult to avoid giving us notice for a transaction. So it's difficult to create a transaction to not have to give us notice. But even if they haven't structured this transaction to avoid notice, or whether or not they have done this, we can evaluate a series of transactions. And of course, each situation is different. We have to look at the relevant facts. But in some cases, we will assess a series of transactions if there has been potential abuse. So do you identify the market share if there are foreign interests? So you're speaking of foreign ownership versus internal investment. This is not what you focus on, but we are actually asking ourselves the question, the difference between domestic and foreign ownership. So have you looked more into these foreign investments? Well, for us, whether it's foreign or domestic, all that matters is competition. The nationality of the company doesn't matter. But oftentimes, with our assessments, we will calculate market shares to have a better idea of who the other actors are in the market. Sometimes these are foreign actors, sometimes they're domestic. This depends on the industry and the relevant facts. Thank you. Now, what is a best practice in your opinion? What's your definition of a best practice that respects competition for fishing, for example? I would say that for us, we really are focused on competition in Canada. We're leaders in this field. And like Mr. Callahan said, we are focusing on supporting pro-competition government rules. And so our role is to promote the application or the enforcement of these pro-competition laws. And we work with small and medium-sized companies to ensure that they understand the issues related to respecting these rules. And we want them to understand our role so that they're able to submit complaints to us or submit notice to us if they suspect that there has been anti-competitive activity in their market. So for us, a best practice is ensuring that these rules are enforced and that companies are respecting the rules. And we want to ensure also that they know how to identify potential behavior that is anti-competitive. Thank you.
That's a little bit over. We'll now go to Ms. Barron for 6 minutes or less, please.
Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Mr. Cameron, my questions are going to be for you, I think, for the most part this round. I wanted to ask, we are hearing about fishers ending up in debt to license owners before they've even started the season because of the lease prices being set before fishing takes place. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that and what the result is, what the impacts are of this.
C'est le mauvais. OK. Oui, excusez-moi, Monsieur le Président, le mauvais micro était allumé, donc les interprètes entendaient mal Madame Barron. Je pense que c'est rétabli. Désolée. Je crois que c'est bon.
Did I say something brilliant? Sorry. Okay, I'll start over. Sounds like we just had some interpretation problems. So basically, I wanted to ask Mr. Cameron about the debt that many fishers are going into to license owners because of the lease price being set before fishing takes place. And I'm wondering if you can speak to the impacts of those situations, or if you have come across situations like that.
Sure. I mean, it certainly happens. I guess the crab fishery is a little different because in most places it's almost a year-round fishery. So you just kind of can't, in other fisheries, maybe they're only 30 days or 60 days, very short term. So you can make that debt mistake multiple times in 1 year and really get yourself in a spot. Crabbing is almost more by the length of it like a job. You can do maybe one or two other fisheries a little bit, but you're committed almost the whole year to it. So if you do that, you and your crew are not making money for the whole year. It's gonna take a lot less time to go badly and your business evaporate than say it would leasing some halibut quota or a prawn license that you can make that bad decision and you and the crew are done in a month and then they go work some other job to make up for it or something. Crabbing, if you do that, it certainly exists, but those people are unfortunately discarded fairly quickly.
Thank you for clarifying. One of the other things that you were talking about was the current licensing policies not being ones of conservation. And I'm wondering if you feel that the current licensing policies are considering the socioeconomic impacts on fishers, and perhaps you can build a little bit more on your thoughts around the considerations that are or not being taken when decisions are being made that impact communities in multiple ways, and also the environment.
Well, I mean, I guess I probably worded it a little poorly. I mean, we do use licensing policy in a sense to set conservation. We have a limited amount of license, but who owns that license it's not like transferring a quota, so it's not used in the same sense. But there's not really much effort at all to socioeconomic goals in our fishery, and that's become really clear in post House appeal decision that those frameworks and safeguards or promotion of socioeconomic benefits just don't really exist.
And what's the impacts that you're seeing? Are there any examples that you can share around the impacts of socioeconomic considerations not being put into consideration? Yeah,
I mean, Area E Tofino harvesters lost 50% of their access to their business, and that sounds like, oh, you lost 50%, but really for them that means 100% of their revenue or profitability. So for them in a very short time frame, the profitability of their business that they've been doing for a long time went away, and then those harvesters moved elsewhere and diluted, access in other parts of the coast. So it's become a coast-wide issue.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Cameron, you also spoke about the tensions between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people as a result of the reallocated access to fisheries and harvesting. We know that reconciliation isn't taking resources from one person and putting it into another, that there's a bigger process that needs to be taken through it. So I could go on, but with no further ado, I just wanted to see if you could share a little bit more information around some of those tensions that you're seeing and what the impacts are that you're seeing on Indigenous and non-Indigenous people.
It's not an area I fish specifically, but when it happened, I think it's really clear to set that it's not like there's naturally tensions. Those tensions are downloaded onto us and projected by poor policy. You can imagine, losing your entire livelihood in a community of people that you work with losing their livelihood, and it's sort of being heralded as reconciliation, what that might bring. And our response to that was to put together a package really quickly to get those harvesters on the water with boats and gear and the capacity to start fishing right away and to fairly mitigate the harvesters who lost access, and that was turned down. And, we're over 2 years since the appeal decision, April of 2021, I guess now, and 3 licenses have been purchased. Single processors have bought more licenses in that time. So.
Okay, thank you. What are the impacts that you're seeing around the crab fishery of food security, access to crab locally for local communities, for it staying here in Canada and so on?
I think we're pretty lucky up until this point, until recently. The crab fishery really started growing significantly in value between the last 5 and 10 years. And so until then, there's not a lot of interest in buying licenses other than fishermen. So it's a very independent fishery up until recently and still in most areas. So crab are available to the public, but if we don't get a policy correction, that will change. The export market is over 90% to China. Some years it's when it's better in one area in the Hecate Strait, more of it goes to the U.S., but for most areas, over 90% is sent to China live. So.
Okay. Thank you. How much time do I have, Mr. Chair? I'm not sure if my timer is still active right now.
20 seconds.
All right. I'll take that back next round.
Okay, we can try that and see what happens. We'll now go to Mr. Small for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's good to see you're alive and well there in Conception Bay South, I guess. Thank you to the witnesses for taking time to come out and take part in this very important study. I guess my question is going to be to Monsieur Guay, by the looks of it here. We've heard numerous witnesses say that, in particular with reference to BC and in Newfoundland, amongst seafood buyers and processors, that they're operating as cartels or in collusion with one another when it comes to buying or competing for product from fishermen. How would you define a cartel or collusion between, in this type of situation between buyers?
Thank you for the question. So if you look at the Competition Act under Section 45, which is the conspiracy provision, and I'm going to get to your specific question.
Yeah, no problem.
So it's a criminal offense for competitors or potential competitors to fix prices, allocate markets, and restrict output in the course of supplying a good or service. So when we're talking about purchasers agreeing together, the problem is that they're not supplying a good or a service. They are on the purchase side, which is what we call basically a buy-side agreement, right? So under the last amendments in 2009 of the Competition Act, the word purchase was taken out of Section 45. So this limits the possibility for us to intervene under the criminal provision.
Yeah, so
for the conspiracy.
Mr. Guay, I know there's a lot of people from the fishing industry watching these hearings here now, and I've heard the word collusion, cartel. I've heard it all my life, frankly, in the fishing industry, and I've heard the Competition Bureau mentioned many times that you guys should be doing investigations. Are you telling me there's there's no possibility that you would ever be able to investigate such?
Well, under the criminal conspiracy provision, it's not possible at this point, given the change to the law. However, there are other ways to investigate, and we can look into situations of that kind under Section 90.1 of the Competition Act, which is a civil provision. I'm not an expert on that in that field, so maybe I can pass it on to one of my colleagues to comment.
Well, absolutely. One of your colleagues, you're definitely more of an expert than I am.
Yeah, correct. So buy-side cartels or conspiracies cannot be looked at criminally right now, with the exception of anything relating to fixing of wages or no-poach agreements. But as my colleague pointed out, can be looked at under the civil provisions of the Competition Act under Section 90.1. I mean, that is, I would point out that is a live issue right now as to whether the Competition Act should be reviewed to be able to look at buy-side cartels under a criminal track. There is currently, the government launched a consultation on the Competition Act. And there are a few notable issues that are taking up a lot of time, but that particular issue is one that's a long-standing issue in competition law of looking at the buy side under criminal provisions.
So, Mr. Durache, if independent harvesters can't move freely between processors, is that what you'd mean? I just heard you mention no poach. Is that what you're referring to? Would that be the type of thing that would fall under no poach?
So no poach would refer to, and just to be clear, this is as a result of amendments that received royal assent last year, but this actually comes into force to the Competition Act on June 23rd of this year, so in a few weeks, where wage-fixing agreements and no-poach agreements now become illegal under Section 45 of the Competition Act. And a no-poach agreement would be an agreement between two employers, reciprocal, where they agree not to poach one another's employees. Okay. So agree not to hire one another's employees.
Okay, so what we're hearing, we've heard from some witnesses and some written witness material as well, that it's a similar thing is happening in the fishery, where processors won't take from each other their suppliers. So that doesn't apply. The no poach wouldn't apply to the fishery in the same way. Am I correct?
I think,
Mr. Small, you're gone over on your time. I would ask the witness if he has an answer, he can send it in writing to the committee, and we'll include it in the study. We'll now go to Mr. Hanley for 5 minutes or less.
Thank you. Thanks to all the witnesses for being here today. I just wanted to start with Mr. Callahan. In your speaking notes, you say quite clearly the Bureau does not regularly evaluate overall levels of concentration or the state of competition, but you look more at an individual circumstances on a case-by-case basis. So is there a body that does look at the overall impact of competition or concentration?
I can thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I can certainly add maybe a bit more nuance to what I said in my opening, in that the Bureau, beyond its enforcement mandate, where we would do specific investigations into conduct such as the merger that I mentioned, allegations of cartels that we've been discussing here, or other aspects of conduct, we can also do market studies. Our powers are circumscribed, so the ability to collect information in those contexts of market studies is quite different from enforcement work. So we can only gather that information for a market study voluntarily or use what is available in the public. And our market studies are really part of our competition promotion mandate. So the audience or the goal of what we do there is really to advocate to policymakers for more pro-competitive regulations or policies. But that might be one scenario where we are trying to look at least the dynamics of competition in a specific market.
Oh, thank you. So to be more specific, have you actually then done a market study in this area?
No, we have not. No.
But it is a possibility.
Yes, it is, and we are guided somewhat by our priorities as an organization in terms of what we will focus on. Our current study that we are working on at the moment has to do with competition in the grocery retail sector. Before that, we have looked at issues in the digital economy, such as digital healthcare. So what we really try to do is focus in on markets that are going to have the biggest impact on competition and for Canadians. So we look to government priorities, the priorities of our minister, and those of Canadians. And those are really kind of what feed into what we focus on for a market study.
Thank you. So a further question would be, you mentioned in responding to Madame Desbiens, that you have a complaints process, but how else do you receive notice? Is there also a reporting requirement that's more proactive than a complaints process?
So Mr. Desrochers mentioned the mandatory notification process with respect to mergers. We have obviously a general ability at the Bureau to gather our own intelligence. That may come from other work that we are doing. We've been increasing our intelligence function at the Bureau to make sure that we kind of are keeping our finger on the pulse of what's happening in competition in markets. But certainly complaints is a big factor in terms of what we may be looking into. And there are specific ways for us to be detecting some of the conduct that was mentioned to you earlier, cartels conduct, which can be some of the most difficult to detect. I'd let my colleague add anything, Mr. Gay, that he may wish to add, but there's a specific program in that area for immunity where we try to encourage members of a cartel to come forward because it is a very difficult area for us to detect. And so, all these things combined is really how we try to identify any competitive conduct.
I know I have less than a minute, but I just wanted to move quickly over to Mr. Cameron. Mr. Cameron, you made 3 recommendations, including restricting sale of licenses. You also talked about capacity and increasing regulatory oversight. I wonder if on the human capacity part, I wonder if you could take 30 seconds and expand somewhat on that.
Not very much, really. We just have no people in the department working on it. We had one person for a year and a half. That person moved on to a different file in December. We understand they've been replaced, but there's just basically no staff capacity put towards potential changes of licensing or realizing socioeconomic protections that were put into the recent changes to the Fisheries Act.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Henley. Right on time. We'll now go to Madame Desbiens for 2.5 minutes or less, please.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. What I'd like to know, firstly, is if you have received complaints from the fishing industry relating to practices that could threaten competition in Canada or in Quebec. Unfortunately, complaints do need to remain confidential at the Bureau, but generally what I would say is that in a year we receive more than 4,000 complaints from Canadians concerning a variety of practices and a variety of industries. And sometimes we will assess them. Now, all complaints are looked over by our agents to see if there is reason to begin an investigation, but that depends on the evidence that we're given. Do you have a lack of resources, or do you have a lack of power to do more in certain sectors? I know we've heard from some individuals that have lost just about everything and have gone through some very difficult experiences. And so we're looking for a way to find solutions for these risks. And I'm wondering if you think you could do more than you're doing now? We have a very clear, simple mandate, and our mandate is to focus on competition, to promote and protect competition in all sectors of the Canadian economy. And in terms of our resources, in 2021, the government significantly increased the Competition Bureau's resources after 10 years of no increases. So that was very well received. In terms of our ability to act and intervene if there are issues pertaining to competition, currently we are looking to modernize the Competition Act in Canada, and I think this is very important so that, and if the Bureau has reason to intervene in a market, we need the law to give us the necessary tools so that we are able to investigate and act quickly to deal with any of these competition issues, be it mergers or market share. And for us, it's very important that we do modernize this Competition Act so that we are able to intervene.
Thank you. We'll now go to Ms. Barron for 2.5 minutes, please, or less.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Cameron, are you seeing many young harvesters entering the industry?
The crab fishery probably has more young harvesters than a lot of other fisheries because of the growing value, but as a whole in the fishing industry, I would say no.
And of these young people that you're seeing entering, of the few that you are seeing, are many or any of them owner-operators of vessels?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a bit of a unique situation in the area where I fish, which is northern British Columbia. I would be the only non-Vietnamese Canadian captain in the fleet. The Vietnamese Canadian population makes up a very big part of the crab fleet, and many of them own the license themselves, or the family owns it, maybe a mom or dad or wife. So not maybe technically owner-operator, but a family-run business, yes.
And have you seen any generational changes over the years around owner-operators and how that's looked, for example, between what you're seeing today and perhaps, even just one generation ago?
I think maybe not to the generation standpoint, but just within the last 5 years, as the fishery has grown in value significantly, we see large processors looking to control costs and buy licenses and more leasing out from processors happening.
Okay, great. Mr. Chair, I didn't time myself.
Around 1 minute and 15 seconds.
Much. My last question, Mr. Cameron, is around specifically the landed price for catch. Do you believe that there are buyers communicating with one another ahead of time to discuss the prices that should be paid? Is this something that you see?
I mean, it's a bit of a speculative thing for me to say, but I know as fishermen, we certainly coordinate with one another as to what prices are. I imagine buyers do something similar, but I can't provide evidence of that.
Okay, thank you. And as far as, I'm going to go one more, as far as the 2019 recommendations that have been put forward, any thoughts on why we've been seeing such delayed movement on the actions that were recommended?
To be quite frank, it doesn't seem like the Pacific region has much interest in moving many of those recommendations ahead. So.
And what do you think could be done to help move those recommendations forward?
I catch crab for a living. I don't know how to herd bureaucrats, unfortunately, but get them doing it faster. I'm sorry, I don't have.
It's a good answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Byron. Yeah, and I think the trophy goes to Mr. Cameron for such a wonderful answer on that one.
Mr. Chair, excuse me, Mr. Chair, I'm just wondering before we break if we could ask the members from the Competition Bureau to supply something in writing that describes what was going on and the changes made in 2009. That I think would be useful to us looking ahead.
Okay,
Sir.
well, I think they've heard the question, and if they can provide the committee with that, I'm sure they'll do that, send it in to the clerk and distribute it to all the members. That concludes our first hour of testimony. I want to, of course, thank our witnesses for coming today and sharing such valuable information with the committee. And we'll suspend for a few moments to change out, and we'll let Mr. Arnold take over for the last hour of testimony with witnesses and questions. Thank you all. Hope to see you soon.
I'd like to call us back to order for the second half of our meeting. I'd now like to welcome the witnesses for the second hour. Representing the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development, we have Carl Van Kessel, Deputy Director, Investment Trade Policy, Chandra Malia, Director General, Trade and Services, Intellectual Property and Investment, Kaylee Stewart, Executive Director, Investment Trade Policy, and representing the Department of Industry, James Byrne, Senior Director, Policy. I'd like to take the time to thank you for appearing today. You'll have 5 minutes for opening statements. I believe Chandra Malia will be opening for that department, and I'm not sure if Global Affairs is going to make opening. Pardon me? Industry is going to make a. If you can, if we can keep the total opening remarks to 6 or so minutes, that would be fantastic. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. My colleagues and I are pleased to appear before this committee today regarding your study of foreign ownership and corporate concentration of fisheries licenses and quota in order to provide an overview of Canada's commitments under international investment treaties to assist you in your ongoing work. There are very few rules pertaining to investments under the World Trade Organization, so most of my remarks will focus on international investment treaties. That's foreign promotion and protection agreements and our chapters in our free trade agreements, which essentially cover the same areas. To begin, it's important to note that investment commitments are fundamentally different from goods market access commitments, with which most people are probably more familiar. The objective of an investment treaty is to create a level playing field for investors and investments of both treaty partners. So parties to an investment treaty commit essentially not to undertake certain types of measures against the investments and investors of the other party, regardless usually of the sector. Importantly, these agreements neither offer preferential treatment to those investors, nor do they offer specific levels of market access to the Canadian market. The core commitments in an investment treaty are numerous. Parties can't discriminate against investors of the other party based on their nationality, whether in comparison to Canadian investors or investors of a third country. Parties cannot expropriate or nationalize investments without fair compensation. Parties can't treat the other investor of the other party in a manner that falls below a minimum standard of treatment found in customary international law. Parties can impose nationality requirements on senior management of an enterprise. They can impose performance requirements that distort business decisions. And finally, they can't limit the cross-border transfer of investment-related funds. However, all of these commitments that I've just mentioned are very much circumscribed by a combination of carefully drafted exceptions and reservations in areas that are typically sensitive to either Canada or the partner with which they're negotiating. Importantly, I wanted to also emphasize that parties to investment treaties maintain their right to regulate domestically to achieve legitimate policy objectives, such as the protection of the environment. It's also important to note that Canada's investment treaties are broadly consistent with one another, but each individual agreement includes differences that would be very difficult to summarize here today. In negotiating these treaties, we seek cabinet mandates, we consult with relevant departments and agencies, we consult with provinces and territories, and of course we consult with stakeholders. To bring it back to fisheries in particular, investment treaties, as I mentioned, do not guarantee a specific level of access to the Canadian market. More than 2 decades ago, Canada also started to include in treaties an exception where we explicitly maintain the policy flexibility to discriminate on the basis of nationality in relation to licensing of fisheries and other fishing-related activities. This means that Canada can give special treatment to Canadian investors in the fisheries sector that it does not need to extend to investors of any treaty partner. The exceptions I just mentioned above, however, do not allow for other violations of our investment treaties, such as the right not to expropriate investments without fair compensation. Finally, all investment treaties, except the for the Canada-US-Mexico agreement include a dispute settlement mechanism, commonly called investor-state dispute settlement, which allows investors of one party to bring a claim against the other to enforce commitments under an international agreement. However, this mechanism cannot force a party to modify its laws. It can only order monetary damages to be paid if a tribunal actually finds that the party in question has violated its treaty obligations. On this point, I would like to emphasize as well that no dispute has ever been brought against Canada in relation to the fisheries industry. To conclude, Canada's international investment treaties neither offer preferential treatment to foreign investors, nor do they offer them a specific level of access to the Canadian market. In most cases, these treaties explicitly provide Canada the flexibility to discriminate on the basis of nationality in relation to licensing of fisheries and other fishing-related activities. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'd be pleased to hand whatever time remains over to my colleague.
Thank you. We're at about 4.5 minutes, but don't feel too rushed.
Okay, wonderful. I'll be very brief. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. My name is James Burns. I'm the director responsible for the Investment Canada Act at ISED, and we administer the Investment Canada Act on behalf of the government. It's a pleasure to be here to support your important study on foreign ownership and corporate concentration in fishing licenses and quota. Aujourd'hui, je parlerai brièvement.
Today, I will briefly speak of the law globally, and then I will answer your questions. I understand that everyone is not necessarily familiar with the way the law works, so I will give you a quick overview of it. So the law plays a very important role in our economy. It aims to make Canada an attractive destination for foreign investment thanks to a regulatory regime that is stable and transparent. In doing so, our laws support economic growth, innovation, and well-paid jobs, all the while protecting Canada's national security.
The ICA provides for the review of significant acquisitions of control in Canadian businesses by non-Canadians for their overall net benefit to Canada. The ICA also provides for the review of all foreign investments on national security grounds. Net benefit reviews focus on the economic impact of acquisitions of control of the most valuable Canadian businesses by non-Canadians. A net benefit review is triggered by a monetary threshold, which ranged this year from $512 million for state-owned enterprises up to $1.9 billion for private sector investors from countries where Canada has a free trade agreement. Canada is an open economy. We are a trading nation. We are an attractive destination for foreign investment, which are needed for our economic prosperity. These thresholds are in place to ensure regulatory certainty for investors and to facilitate investment. Now, on the other side of the Act, the Investment Canada Act provides authority to review foreign investments that could be injurious to Canada's national security. Here, I wish to emphasize that all foreign investment, no matter their value or where they originate from, including greenfield and minority investments, are subject to review for national security. The National Security Review process is undertaken in consultation with national intelligence and security agencies, and the National Security Review provisions apply to all industries, including the fisheries sector. Le gouvernement du Canada n'a pas hésité.
The government of Canada did not hesitate to take action to block transactions that are not in the interest of Canada. We have never compromised and will never compromise Canada's national security.
Provides useful statistics on our net benefit reviews, as well as guidance on the use of our national security review authorities. I would note that there have been over 30 blocks or divestiture orders and investor withdrawals over the past 5 years. So we have been making efforts to provide more transparency and guidance for foreign investors and Canadian businesses. For example, our national security guidelines have an illustrative list of factors that are considered during national security reviews. For example, the effects of a transaction on the transfer of sensitive technology, critical minerals, and sensitive personal data are considered. The last point that I'll note is that in December 2022, the government introduced Bill C-34 to modernize specifically the national security provisions of the Investment Canada Act. This bill is currently being studied by the Standing Committee on Science and Industry, and the goal of these amendments is to ensure that Canada is able to address evolving threats that can arise from foreign investment, while also enhancing transparency and efficiency in the national security review process. Thank you very much for your time. Happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you for your opening remarks. We'll go to the first round of questioning now. We'll start out with Mr. Small.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to the witnesses for coming out to take part in our study. My question, Mr. Chair, is for Mr. Burns. I just heard you mention national security. Food security is a part of national security. Would you agree?
It could be. It can certainly be interpreted as that. Yes.
So, what percentage of the Canadian fishery would a company like Royal Greenland be allowed to buy in terms of the processing sector?
Well, thanks for the question. I'm not sure that I have the. I'm not sure that I have the ability to answer that question. I'm not like we don't really look at in those terms.
So, but along that same line of questioning, Mr. Burns, if a foreign company like Royal Greenland, for example, state-owned, were to make significant buy-ins in the Canadian fishing industry, do you think that could possibly represent a threat eventually, or not? I'm just using Royal Greenland as an example to our national food security.
Well, I will first perhaps talk a little bit about how we engage on a regular basis with a number of different partners across the Government of Canada to identify areas of most significant import to our national security. This can include partners like, security and intelligence agencies, as well as Natural Resources Canada, Transport Canada, other parties to the like. We haven't to date had engagements with any interdepartmental partners that have raised fisheries or the concentration of ownership as a significant national security threat to Canada. And so to date, we haven't yet had to sort of answer that question.
All right. So on this past Monday, May 29th, the clerk of this committee circulated an email from a global affairs official who wrote, and I quote, "Canada's most recent investment treaties, starting roughly in 2000, include an exception where we maintain the full policy flexibility to discriminate on the basis of nationality in relation to licensing of fisheries and other fisheries-related activities." So, however, in your opening statement today, you stated that the core commitments in an investment treaty include a commitment that, I quote here, "Parties cannot discriminate against investors of the other party based on their nationality, whether in comparison to Canadian investors or investors of a third-party country." Please clarify, what do you mean by discriminate? Ms. Malia.
I'll refer this question to my colleague.
Yes, thank you for the question, Mr. Speaker. I guess perhaps I could just take a minute to explain in a little more detail what kind of provisions I was referring to. First, I would say the most obvious one is that in many of our investment agreements, we explicitly exempt, as I mentioned, licensing of fishing and fishing-related activities from non-discrimination commitments. Those would be commitments related to the treatment of national treatment and the treatment related to most favored nation treatment. This includes Canada's main free trade agreements, such as the agreement with the United States and Mexico, the CPTPP, and CETA. It also includes our modern FIPAs. In practical terms, what this means is that Canada has full policy flexibility to accord preferential treatment to Canadian investors when licensing fishing activities without having to extend that same treatment to investors of other countries. Second, our investment agreements allow Canada to give preferential treatment to investors of one country over investors of another country when that preferential treatment is something that we've negotiated in the context of an international agreement. So the first treatment that I mentioned is what we call sort of more national treatment. The second one is what we typically refer to as most favored nation treatment. And these protections have been developed and negotiated in the context of our trade agreements in consultation with Fisheries and Oceans Canada. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, in negotiating trade agreements, we always consult with relevant departments and agencies, as well as provinces and territories and stakeholders. So hopefully, Mr. Small, I've answered the question that you asked.
So, I guess. So in light of Canada's commitments in its trade and investment agreements, is Canada allowed to prohibit foreign investment in specific sector activities, such as owning commercial fishing licenses and quota?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Speaker. To answer that question, I guess what I would say is that the reservations that Canada has taken in its trade agreements are related to fishing licenses and as well as fishing-related activities. Licenses and fishing-related activities. The exception specifies that fishing-related activities include, and I mean, I'll quote here just to be very clear with what we have negotiated in the context of our international trade agreements: entry of foreign vessels to Canada's exclusive economic zone, territorial sea, internal waters of ports, and the use of any services therein. That said, I guess what I would say to conclude is that we would defer to regulatory experts and legal counsel to really define exactly what that means.
Okay, thank you. That's your time, Mr. Small. We'll now go to Mr. Morrissey.
Time is up.
For 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. My question, and I'll ask whoever's prepared to address it, speak to it. One of the growing concerns on the East Coast fishery is the growing concentration of Chinese ownership within the lobster supply chain at the dock level. What is the existing trading agreements that Canada has with China? What is the major ones that govern how we interact with Chinese companies?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I would say that the main international investment treaty that governs our interactions with China is the agreement that we negotiated, referred to as a Foreign Investment and Promotion and Protection Agreement. In broad terms, I'd say that this agreement contains more or less the same commitments that one would find in most of Canada's international investment treaties. I'd say one notable difference is that it doesn't guarantee equal treatment to Canadian and Chinese investors before an actual investment is made. We refer to this as treatment pre-establishment, before the company actually comes and establishes in Canada. With respect to the treatment of fisheries and fishing, the Canada-China FIPA is in line, I'd say, with most of our modern practices and provisions. The agreement, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, the agreement contains two key exceptions, or what we call reservations, that directly deal with fishing and fisheries. As I mentioned already, the first one is that it explicitly exempts licensing of fishing.
Okay, that's fine. I understand. I'm on the licensing side.
And it doesn't contain, just to be clear again, it doesn't contain any market access commitments.
One of the concerns that has been getting a lot of attention is the ability of companies in Canada, 100% owned by China, incurring losses in Canada because they're not dealing with Canadian banks. They get their cash flow by coming in and out. They do not require operating financing, and so they incur losses in Canada, and they sell into the Chinese market. They're a Chinese held company at a higher profit, and then therefore undermining some of the Canadian-owned companies that don't have the ability to do that. Are you aware of this practice, and how is it governed under our trading agreements? Am I clear on where I'm going?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. To answer the question specifically, I am not aware of that specific practice, and I would say that I cannot speak to its coverage under our international treaties. I don't believe it's something that we would be negotiated in the context of an international investment treaty.
But the frustration coming from Canadian companies is because they show a loss here, they don't pay any taxes to Canadian companies, so we're losing multiple ways. But they're also at a competitive advantage in their own back market with a significant disadvantage to the Canadian producer, and will ultimately have a negative impact on the purchase price they can that fishers receive. So who is monitoring this particular practice? And there's more and more. There's been a huge growing presence of Chinese-backed companies and money buying up East Coast Canadian seafood processing companies. And so far they cannot get, well, they can actually indirectly get into the license part through the processor they have if they finance it. This is a serious issue. In fact, I'll go to the issue of the Halifax live shipment terminal is now 100% owned by Chinese interests, and they'll only serve their own interests. So it's blocking out some of the Canadian companies. Again, who is monitoring this?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I think that the question is probably best answered by colleagues at the Fisheries and Oceans Canada, as they have a deep expertise of the issues.
Fisheries and Oceans Canada?
Well, they have my understanding is that they have a deep expertise of all issues related to Canada's competitiveness in the fisheries and fisheries processing industries. So that's my answer, Mr. Chair.
I'm a bit alarmed that external affairs and nobody answered from industry. I see Mr. Burns wants to get in because nobody's surprised. This is making the media in this last while, and it's a real concern developing on the East Coast from the fish harvester right through, because if they get total control of the processing and shipping, they do then control the price paid to fishers.
Sure. If I can just simply add that under the Investment Canada Act, all foreign investments are reviewed on a case-by-case basis, and the facts of each case are assessed and carefully considered.
But excuse me, Mr. Burns, we just heard in an earlier panel from a witness that's saying there was a significant part of that legal identity removed in 2009 that removes their ability to look at the social economic impact on the community they would have.
Mr. Morrissey, your time is up. If the witnesses want to provide information further in writing back to the committee.
Chair, I would like to have the answers written answers to my questions.
Okay, we'll move on now to Madame Debienne with the block.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to follow the same direction as my colleague. So we've had witnesses appear anonymously here. There have been people who are deeply struggling because their family business, a generational business, did not succeed. They had to liquidate all their assets because they found themselves in an impossible situation. And around this table, we're looking for the solution to an imminent problem, and that's the food sovereignty of Quebec and of Canada. And the Saint Laurent is full of resources, and the world wants to access these resources. And so, yes, clearly, it's to be expected that everyone wants a piece of the pie here. And so it's expected that there will be some funds coming from outside of the country, but they need to be respecting their tax obligations. My colleague across the way mentioned this earlier. So what do we say to Quebecers who are concerned, those who have lost their company? Do we tell them to submit a complaint with the Competition Bureau? But that costs money. And we'd have to tell them, well, you might not be eligible for a court hearing. Do we tell them to go to the Department of Foreign Affairs because it's a question of foreign investment? I want to know what we tell these people.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I guess from a negotiating and policy perspective related to international investment agreements, what I can say simply is that the purpose of my testimony today is really to provide an explanation of the nature of the commitments that we've taken in our international investment treaties. From that perspective, I guess what I would say is that our international investment treaties are meant to provide a safe and predictable framework for people to invest in Canada. With respect to those issues, Mr. Chair, I mean, I would certainly suggest again that this might be a matter that my experts at the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada could answer.
Okay. The experts from the DFO, well, there's not many of them.
Qu'est-ce qui...
Given the introduction that I gave earlier, this wealth that we have in our oceans needs to be protected. And it seems that the DFO, I could say, is in this gray area. I'm not exactly sure what term to use here. Mr. Morrissey, could you help me out? It's a gray zone. Nobody seems to be able to control foreign markets. That use very specific techniques, and I think that it would be interesting to study this more deeply. Maybe several departments could work together, the DFO with the Competition Bureau, with the Finance Bureau. I'm not sure what team would be ideal, but we could establish a team to really dig into this. What do you think about this? Could there be some type of collaboration to really target this problem so that we can implement tools and avoid losing our food security in the long term?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I mean, as trade negotiators, we are certainly always willing to work with and collaborate with our colleagues across the government, including with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. Perhaps, what I would also add, and it's something I said in my opening remarks, is that, when Canada negotiates investment treaties, we do protect the Government of Canada's right to regulate in the pursuit of legitimate policy objectives. The regulatory regime, in other words, is allowed to evolve and change over time. And moreover, I would also like to say that there's nothing in these agreements that exempt foreign investors from having to comply with Canadian laws and regulations. In other words, foreign investors are subject to the same laws and regulations as domestic investors. So, as I mentioned also in my opening remarks and some of the questions I've answered already, there are a number of ways that we as negotiators and my colleagues at the Department of Fisheries and Oceans as domestic regulatory leads work together to help to develop some of the some of the framework that we include in our international trade agreements, we're certainly always happy to continue doing that and to look at new issues as they arise, including the ones that you've mentioned.
And perhaps if I may supplement, the Investment Canada Act has two components. We review significant foreign acquisitions of control, and we review foreign investments for national security injury. Given the specific application of the Act, the Investment Canada Act ought to be viewed as one of many tools in a toolbox to address foreign ownership challenges in fisheries. So in order to fully address the scope of the issue that I think you identified, I do agree that other tools could be explored, including provincial legislation and policies that could be used to address fishery licenses and competition policy to address unfair competition.
Okay, I'll have to just to stop you there. We're going half a minute over, so on to Ms. Barron, please.
Thank you to our new Mr. Chair. I have a question, and I'm not sure who to address it to, so perhaps I'll ask it and then you can let me know who the best person is. But I'm just wondering about what, if you can share with us your thoughts around what barriers there are in place to implement an immediate ban on further license and quota transfers to foreign beneficial owners. So what's stopping us? What types of things would you foresee as issues with moving forward in that direction, if any?
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Chair. From an international treaty perspective, as I mentioned in my opening remarks and a few of the questions I've answered, we have negotiated some flexibility in our trade agreements that would allow the Government of Canada to take some decisions with respect to offering preferential access to Canadian investors and investments. So in terms of what those barriers are, I can only speak to, from my perspective, the international investment treaties that we've negotiated. And as I mentioned, we have actually negotiated some policy flexibility in those areas.
Perhaps I would supplement as well, Mr. Chair, by noting that, the introduction of a wholesale approach to block certain types of investment those would risk, there would be reputational risks to Canada as a location for inbound foreign investment across multiple sectors. And ultimately, the goal is to ensure that Canada is seen as an open destination for foreign investment, and to block beneficial ownership sales could have certain reputational effects for Canada.
What are your thoughts through the chair, Mr. Burns, around ways in which we might be able to overcome those challenges that you're talking about? If we were to move forward, what would be some of your thoughts on that?
I think that would veer into personal opinion rather than my role as a regulator. But I'm not sure. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you. I was leaving you the space to see if you had some thoughts. That's good. I do know that I'm feeling particularly, what's the word? Like sharing today. And I know that my colleague, MP Hardy, does have some questions that I am interested to hear the answers to. So I'm going to actually give the remainder of my time over to MP Hardy.
You have 3 minutes. She's
thank
generous.
you very much. That will be noted. Thank you kindly. With respect to the foreign investment protection, measures that we have in place, I'm just wondering how they would apply in a situation where we're trying to wind down an investment. Right now, our concern is that there are investments in Canada by entities that have distorted the market, which we'll get to in a minute. But we perceive that there's too much of the licenses and quotas in the hands of foreign investors. If we were to take steps, as was taken in Atlantic Canada some years ago, to basically give them an amount of time to get out of the market, would that run afoul of some of our treaties and protection agreements?
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Chair. I guess what I would say is that this issue is not explicitly covered through the reservations and exemptions that we take in our international investment treaties. They allow Canada, as I mentioned, to give preferential treatment to Canadian and third-party investors. But in practical terms, the exceptions and reservations mean that our main investment agreements do not force the government to give fishing licenses to foreign investors on the same terms as it does to Canadian investors. However, the exception, as I said, does not explicitly allow, for example, the rescinding of licenses. So once the licenses are given, the exceptions that we've taken in international investment treaties do not specifically give the Government of Canada the discretion to rescind the license.
So I'm sorry, I'll intercede here.
Yeah.
Does that mean then that we could be taken to court or face some other retaliation if, in fact, we required people to divest?
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Chair. I guess my final thought on the first question, if I may, is that our agreements.
Please be brief, because
yes,
I have
only
another
allow
question
for the
after.
expropriation. I wanted to get to the issue of expropriation because I think that is the heart of perhaps of what you're asking. In our investment agreements require that if we're going to expropriate an investment, we have to do so for a public purpose. We must do so with due process under domestic law, and we have to accompany that by fair compensation for the value of the investment.
All right, thank you.
And sorry, and then to answer your final question about dispute settlement, yes, if an investor alleges that Canada is not in compliance with its international investment obligations, almost all of our treaties allow that investor the right to pursue investor-state dispute settlement, and as well, of course, the investor has the right to pursue dispute settlement in domestic courts.
Thank you. Sometimes there's
Thank you,
too little time, and I don't
Mr.
get the
Hardy.
other
That's
question.
2 seconds,
Okay.
so unless you're really
Okay.
quick. We'll move on to the next round now. Mr. Bragdon for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for taking the time to be here today and to share with us on this very important subject. A couple of questions, and I want to circle back to where my colleague was referencing a little bit ago in regards to Canada's food security and the questions that arise out of that, and as it relates to foreign ownership and increasingly so foreign corporations' involvement in Canadian waters. As a result of what's happened in the last few years, and we're seeing increased anxiety and the absolute critical importance of securing our food supply chains, what steps and mechanisms would you recommend that the government do in order to ensure the protection of Canada's food supply in the event of geopolitical uncertainty that's going on around the globe? Are there specific recommendations you would put before this committee to say, here's some practical steps that can be taken right now to help alleviate the concerns of many Canadians about their food security and the future of the fishing industry on all of our coast? I'll start with you, Ms. Amelia, and then we can go from there. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Chair. Unfortunately, I don't think that's a question that I can answer. Perhaps my colleague from Industry Canada can answer that question. My responsibility is related to international investment treaties, and food security is certainly not one of those issues that I would say is within the responsibility within my responsibilities.
Mr. Burns?
I'm not sure you're going to like my answer either, because this is my responsibility is to help to administer the Investment Canada Act, which governs the review of inbound foreign investment. So investments that have already taken place or that are below a particular monetary threshold and have not triggered a net benefit review. These are sort of the conditions precedent. I can say that any investment, if a foreign investor makes a significant acquisition of control, the Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry has within his authority the ability to consider a range of economic factors, which touch upon both our food security as well as our the nature of the economic activity related to a particular investment, the effect of an investment on competition within an industry, the compatibility of an investment or an investor with our national industrial economic and cultural policies, and the contribution of the investment to Canada's ability to compete in world markets. So, if the minister is not satisfied that this investment would meet our net benefit test, then certainly the minister has within his authority the ability to block said investment. And more often than not, in the engagement with investors and different parties, the minister will accept binding undertakings which would help to ensure a certain level of production in Canada, or keeping the management team Canadian, or keeping the headquarters in Canada. These are some of the typical undertakings that are accepted by the minister in certain cases. It probably doesn't answer your larger question about what are the recommendations that we would put forward to support food security, but certainly the protection of a marketplace in Canada is something that helps to ensure that we have the ability to do that.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Burke, because it definitely plays a role, and it is related. And I think, obviously, I'm referencing, maybe through a layman's lens, the concerns that we hear on the ground as it relates to ensuring a future for the Canadian fishery, owned by Canadians as much as possible, employing Canadians as much as possible in a way that provides wonderful, safe, healthy, nutritious protein onto the world's markets that benefits our own communities, but also the world. And I think that's a question that's on their mind. But Ms. Melia, in regards to your opening remarks, you also stated parties to investment treaties maintain the right to regulate domestically to achieve legitimate policy objective, such as the protection of health, safety, and environment. That's the end of the quote. Where are these legitimate policy objectives defined? And are these policy objectives defined in Canada's trade and investment agreements? I don't know how much time we have, Mr. Chair, but
Your time is up, so
okay.
we
If
could
you want
get
to put it
that.
in writing, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. On now to Mr. Cormier, please, online.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Earlier, Mr. Burns, you said that transactions that aren't in the interest of Canada would likely be assessed. And my colleague just asked some similar questions to the ones I wanted to ask. I have 15 processing companies in my region. Some of them are worth several $1 million. So let's say we have a foreign investor from whatever country. They approach some of these owners and offer, let's say, $25 million to buy their company. If I've understood correctly, you're saying that the minister would be able to take a look at this, or would at least be made aware of this transaction to ensure that everything was done legally. Is that correct?
Merci beaucoup pour la
Thank you very much for the question.
Note two things. Yes, the Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry, in consultation with the Minister of Public Safety, has the ability to review any investment in Canada on grounds of national security.
Okay.
The second thing
Yeah, go ahead.
The second piece that I would flag for you is simply that the net benefit provisions of the Investment Canada Act kick in only in the event that an investment is above a particular monetary threshold. As such, an investment that you've noted where there's an investment around $25 million would be it would not be subject to net benefit review, in the same way that a large-scale investment that exceeded the thresholds would be subject to review.
Parfait, merci.
Thank you. And then a quick question. Do the provinces have a role to play in terms of monitoring these transactions?
Each province has the remit to review investments, and we consult regularly with our provincial and territorial partners. And I would suggest that the provinces, territories, and other partners have the ability to review and assess investments in their jurisdictions.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Byrne. Mr. Chair, I'm going to give the remaining of my time to my colleague, Mr. Hardy.
Okay, there's 2 minutes remaining.
Thank you. Everybody's being so generous today. That's so nice. Mr. Burns, we've seen a number of different scenarios where a threshold is set, and then people game the system by coming in just under the threshold. In the case of what appears to be happening in Atlantic Canada with the acquisition of processors, does your department look at the cumulative investments over time to see, in fact, how much is being aggregated into one foreign investor?
Thanks very much for your question, Chair. Our department in the administration of the Investment Canada Act works with a variety of different partners to gather intelligence, to assess risk. And so, as you noted, investments below a particular threshold would not be subject to a net benefit review, but all would be subject to a national security review. And so when you talk about cumulative investment, that is one factor that is raised in the context of a national security review.
We're not necessarily talking about national security here. We're really talking about scooping away, social, environmental, community benefits. This isn't a threat to our sovereignty, but it is a real threat. So I'm just going to park that one with you. But I also wanted anybody that wants to comment on money dumping. We've seen not necessarily money laundering, although that's something that this committee has looked into in this study. But we've seen literally what we would call stupid money coming in that's trying to hide from, a foreign government. And they come over and they invest in boats, in houses, in airplanes, luxury cars, fishing licenses, and quotas, and they overpay quite significantly just simply as a way of getting their money out of one country and into the relative safety of this country. Who looks into that?
If you can provide a quick answer,
Sure.
or else in writing, the time is up.
Sure thing. So under the Investment Canada Act, we do review investments on a case-by-case basis, and the facts of each case are assessed and carefully considered. And we look at whether investments are beneficial to Canadians or alternatively can lead to national security risks in the context of beneficial ownership. But I don't know if perhaps my partners from GAC might have something to add.
To Madame Dubien.
Président. Thank you, Mr. Chair. There's one concern. It always seems as though we're falling behind. There was the pandemic that surprised us, and it made us realize the extent to which our assets and their sovereignty is critical. And so everyone is concerned by this more than before. And there was a study undertaken by this committee in a similar field. And the goal was to find a balance, because it's expected that there will be some foreign investment. Everyone understands that. But we need a team so that we are maintaining our country and Quebec's ability to be the first people that are profiting from our resources. But there are many countries who are interested in our marine products, and oftentimes there's overconsumption. And it's like they sort of look around, and whenever there's a bit of availability, they jump on it. And what's happening is that we're giving away our ownership of our ocean's wealth. And this is something that's been passed down from generation to generation, knowledge that's been passed down. And I think we're not necessarily realizing that in dividing up these actors, those that know the industry the most, well, we're actually making these communities and these people poorer. They're worse off, and everyone's going to lose because of this. And how can we sound the alarm so that people realize that not everyone can take something from this sort of buffet? We have to think about whether or not there will be something available for us tomorrow. So is there some sort of mechanism that could be implemented with the DFO, with Foreign Affairs, and I forget the name of this other department, but to ensure that we have a strong foundation, which is essential. We have lots of experts in Quebec on fishers, harvesters that are also owners. So how can we find a solution for this to guarantee this sovereignty?
Répondre personnellement.
And you can give me your personal opinion too.
More than you.
Ah mon Dieu! Non mais répondez-moi par écrit. Répondez-nous.
Okay, send me a written response, please. Is that okay, Mr. Chair? A written response? Thank you. Sorry. I thought I had 6 minutes. My apologies.
Shut up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll try not to take up my entire question period asking the question. That was good. It was really good. Thank you for your responses. Mr. Burns, I was reflecting a little bit on some of the responses that you provided before, and I don't know if this is going to be a personal question or not, but basically I was thinking about the fact that you were speaking to some of the reputational challenges that may occur to moving forward in this direction on changing the foreign investment around our fisheries and so on. At the same time, what we're seeing is a foreign extraction of our public natural resource. I mean, this is a finite natural resource. Wouldn't it be to our benefit to take the time needed to restructure our licensing policies to ensure that the benefits are going back into our communities here in Canada, going back to local fishers instead of being extracted into other countries? Thank you.
Your point about restricting licenses is not something that would fall within the remit of the Investment Canada Act. But what I can say regarding reputational risk is that Canada is seen as a preferred destination for foreign investment, and that's partly because we have a secure marketplace. We have a degree of investor certainty that is put in place by having strong, robust marketplace frameworks. If one were to, selectively choose, we will be doing this in this sector, and we'll be doing this in a separate sector, we'll be doing this in another, it undermines that sort of wider national consideration for a secure and transparent marketplace. So I would simply point out that's something that would be front of mind for us, because our goal as a regulator is to ensure we have clear and transparent processes for review, which allows commerce to happen in a fair and consistent fashion.
6 seconds is all that's left, so that's not much. So I want to thank the witnesses for being here today, taking the time to appear for us. I think we've got some good information that came out today, so thank you very much. Just on to a piece of committee business, and the witnesses are free to go if they like, if they'd like to depart. For next week, we have we've got let's see. June 5th, we're scheduled to spend the first hour receiving a DFO update on the government response to the 2019 report on BC licensing, and then spend the second hour on drafting instructions for the foreign ownership and concentration report. I'd like to ask the committee if they would like to push the foreign ownership and corporate concentration drafting instructions to the following Monday, June the 12th, as the second hour of that meeting is currently vacant. Would everyone be acceptable to that? Okay, great. We've consulted with the chair's office and the clerk, and they've said there's no problems with this. So, if with that, we'll move that the drafting instructions to the 12th. Okay. Okay. Anything else? Thank you. Meeting adjourned.